Welcome to the Overby Center. Today, our moderator for a program on corrections is Jerry Mitchell, award-winning investigative reporter for the Clarion-Ledger, who's written recently on problems in prisons. Jerry is known throughout the country for his groundbreaking work on unsolved civil rights killings, and his work has helped send 4 Klansmen to prison and made him a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. Our panel consists of Andy Taggart, second from the right, who is co-chair of the Governor's Task Force on Corrections. Jackson Attorney, he's an author, political television show co-host, former chief of staff to the late Governor Kirk Fordyce, and a former Madison County supervisor. Like Jerry, Andy's been here for programs before, and we're glad to have him back.
Thank you very much.
Marshall Fisher, seated next to Jerry here on Jerry's left. Marshall is Mississippi's new Corrections Commissioner as of January. A veteran lawman, he won national notice as head of the state's Bureau of Narcotics when Mississippi passed one of the toughest anti-methamphetamine laws in the country. Before that, he spent 2 decades with the Federal Drug Enforcement Administration and ran the DEA's Mississippi office. State Senator Lydia Chassaniol, she is vice chair of the Senate's Corrections Committee. From Winona, she's served in the Senate since 2007 and chairs the Tourism Committee. She's also an Ole Miss graduate. Eric Lambert. Dr. Lambert is chair and professor of legal studies at Ole Miss. He's a longtime researcher in the fields of criminology and corrections, including prison staffing and personnel at private prisons. Once long ago, it's rumored he worked for the Federal Bureau of Prisons. And he's also reliably reputed to be a big fan of Ole Miss basketball. Jerry's going to be our moderator, and I will turn the program over to him. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. Some of these statistics you probably know. I mean, the United States incarcerates more than almost any developed nation per capita. And Mississippi is at least historically, it's been worse. Incarcerating more people than China, Russia. Pick your despot nation, and we're higher. Anyway, in 2013, we ballooned up to over 22,000 state inmates. But here's the good news: it's been declining since. And in fact, it's now under 19,000, I believe.
Yes, sir.
The latest numbers, and that's thanks to an aggressive parole board and some law passed by the lawmakers as well. Anyway, the Clarion-Ledger, we did a package. Some of you may have seen it. It is still online if you just Google Hard Look at Hard Time. But we did a series about some of the problems in prison and corruption, violence, killings, and different things in prison. And kind of interestingly, then Commissioner Chris Epps was not real kind toward our series. And I'm not saying there's any connection, but he got indicted less than 2 weeks after it finished. So anyway, but he just pleaded guilty the other day to corruption charges. And it's sad. I mean, obviously it's sad to have that happen. But in the wake of that, Marshall Fisher got appointed, and you've had you had some experience in corrections early in your career, didn't you?
I did.
And worked as a probation officer, I guess, is that right?
Yes,
sir. Is that right? And then Andy Taggart now is chairing a task force to basically look at these contracts, which is where a lot of this corruption arose. So anyway, I thought I'd start out with a couple questions for the audience. Hope that's okay. How many of you are 18 or older? Just raise your hand. All right. And how many of you have either graduated from high school or have a GED? Just raise your hand. You are all qualified to be correctional officers, and just come down and make your application. I'm sure Marshall Fisher would be happy to take it. That's literally the qualifications for being a correctional officer in Mississippi. So I thought it would be good to start with, A lot of students probably have no idea what it's like to be a correctional officer, and those are kind of the people that are on the front lines of corrections. And what's it like having? I mean, that's a huge responsibility. Marshall, give them a brief picture of what it's like, life behind prison and the life of a correctional officer.
Well, I want to qualify it by, I did have some time in corrections as a probation and parole officer. I never have really worked behind the
Right.
prison walls necessarily. I have sent some people there. I have had some limited experience since I've been with as a commissioner. One thing I will say though, the 18 qualification has been moved as of about 10 days ago.
That's right, it's 21 now, right?
We raised it to 21.
Sorry, you got to be 21 now.
So when you're 21, come see us. And the reason I did that, I'll say this, is I think 18 is far too young to be behind prison walls interacting with inmates, convicted felons. The people that work behind these walls, as it has been before up until a few weeks ago, you had to be at least 18 years old. They go through 4 weeks of training right now in an academy setting, sort of a paramilitary setting where they are taught by other seasoned corrections officers, and there's a format that they go through, a curriculum, if you will. That, in my opinion, is not long enough. We're changing that to 8 weeks. We're in the process of doing that as we speak. In fact, the next academy will be 8 weeks. They're just having to put together the curriculum, and they're going to have what we call field training officers, if you will. They man post. We don't necessarily do the towers
What's
anymore.
the man post? What do you mean by that?
Well, there'll be like a pod where you might overlook 2 different cell blocks,
right.
Where if you consider like looking at 2 triangles, and you may have 50 inmates on one side and 50 on another, and you may be the only person manning that post watching these people. Now they're behind the walls.
Right.
But at times the officers have to go in there with them. You have prisoners who do not tend to cooperate. If you've got somebody doing a life sentence, say at Parchman, they don't really have a lot of incentive right. to be cooperating with the officers. They're not armed
right.
behind the walls. They don't have nightsticks. They don't have weapons. They don't have
no
tasers.
Weapons at all.
So it's a daunting task, and it's not for the faint of heart.
Now, you tried to get the pay raised for, the current pay is, am I right? Is it right, Grace? About 24,000 somewhere, 25?
22.
22, pardon me, I'm off a little bit. 22,000.
$22,000 is a starting salary to be a corrections officer. That, I think you can qualify for SNAP.
Yeah, you do. If you have a family of 3 or more, you qualify for.
It's not enough. We made an attempt to get the legislature to raise that salary during the session. It didn't happen this year. We're working very hard. We're going to start working very hard toward next year, but I have some other options that we may be able to use.
Administratively, are you able to do that, or you have the power to do that, or not really?
We came out from under the purview of State Personnel Board, and that allows me some flexibility. Yes, sir.
Okay. Eric, I mean, I know you've had experience with Bureau of Prisons and all that stuff. Anything you want to add along those lines about the life of a correctional officer and really what it's like, a picture of what it's like behind bars?
Certainly. I started off my career after graduating in my early 20s as a correctional officer. You have to have good human relation skills. Most of the inmates are coming back to the community. About 90% will follow the rules. They'll follow whoever's in charge. There's 10% who are going to be troublemakers, so you have to control them. But one of the things is if you treat people, you talk, dialogue is very important, dealing with problems quickly and efficiently. It's a rewarding career. I will say one thing is, for a while in the Federal Bureau of Prisons, we would come to states because they do pay more in the Federal Bureau of Prisons, so we recruit things. For example, in Louisiana and Mississippi, we get state troopers who'd come and get a $10,000 automatic raise. And so I agree with the Commissioner, pay is very important, particularly if you look at Maslow's basic needs. And so there is a certain pay level that, in order to attract the best. And
Right.
So, but it's a rewarding career, and if you like working with people, it's a unique opportunity.
Yeah, it is. So corrections is one of the biggest line items, obviously, in the budget, and I know you as a lawmaker have to deal with that. I mean, it's like huge. I mean, you compare it. I mean, it's equal to. You could probably take a lot of agencies and say it's more than their budget.
Yeah.
What about that, Senator? I mean, in terms of, the cost of putting people
I
behind.
think the main thing that happened some years back, and Andy will remember this because he was working for Governor Fordyce when I first met him, there was a lock them up and throw away the key mentality. And legislation was passed so that everyone had to serve 85% of their sentence, regardless of what the crime was.
Right.
Whether it was a nonviolent offender or a violent offender. So that was sort of putting a purse snatcher in the same category with a knife-wielding maniac, if you will. Right. And our corrections budget skyrocketed. And forgive me, because I can't remember the numbers as well as I once did, but it just went up to well over $300 million in a snap. And at the time that I served on the parole board, which was starting at 97, there was an effort to try to parole more people. Right. We were being encouraged to parole more people, but it was hard to find a few good men or women to parole, and that's the great fear. If you're on the parole board, you have to make a quick assessment of someone. We used to sit across the table from them, and it's hard to size somebody up quickly like that and think, well, what's their success rate going to be? That's like looking out into this audience and saying, who's going to be the next Bill Gates? Because you really can't just do that quickly. So we were trying to parole people and yet keep public safety as the paramount thing that we were looking at. The budget now has, because we've been able to parole more people, the current parole board is paroling more people, I think we're going to see some lowering of the cost of corrections, and I think Marshall Fisher, as the head of corrections, is going to do a good job with controlling the budget. I have every reason to think he'll be very successful with that. So, but that was the reason the cost of corrections went up so much for the state.
Andy, I was going to ask you, I know the governor has tasked the task force, kind of the main thrust behind that had to do with no-bid contracts. And, I might add kind of interestingly, overall, we looked at that and there have been, I think I got the figure right, I think it's $6.5 billion in no-bid contracts that the Mississippi state government has levied over the past 4 years, which is quite a few, way beyond corrections. I mean, Right. But obviously, you're tasked with looking at it from a correction standpoint and that standpoint. What's been your assessment so far of that? In terms of looking at those no bid contracts and things along those lines?
Well, of course, this is the sort of thing that can help cure insomnia because it's just so mind-numbingly academic unless you think about what it really means on the ground. The hard thing for us to grapple with, you all, is that the law was complied with from a procurement standpoint, meaning the hoops you're supposed to jump through to have contracts awarded in a $300+ million department of state government were all complied with. And still, depending on what actual facts ultimately are documented, something on the order of $1 million was stolen in bribes and kickbacks. So you think to yourself, for heaven's sakes, the system worked and someone stole $1 million. And it's an important life lesson. If somebody's going to steal, they're going to steal. There aren't enough rules, regulations, guards, guns, and jails in the world to keep folks from stealing if they're going to steal. So from a public policy perspective, our job is to try to make it as hard as possible to steal on the one hand, but not cause the operations of state government to grind to a halt on the other hand. And that's the tough balance that the governor has tasked us with. Right.
What about on your end, Marshall, in terms of looking at those contracts and things like that? Have you really had time to, I know you've got a lot of different things you're having to juggle and look at this point. Have you really had time to look at the no bid contracts? Basically, Have you done like 0 of those since you've been in, or have you had to do some emergency contracts because of this and that, or what's the latest on that?
We haven't really had to do any emergency contracts. We had to amend one with one of the private prisons related to the number of prisoners that we committed to be
committed
there.
to them.
And we're in the process of rebidding every existing major contract. And we're pretty far down the line. We've rebid.
What's the latest on that?
We
Updates on that.
rebid the food service. We haven't awarded that contract yet. We have rebid the medical service.
Right.
Have not awarded that one yet. There's a process. You
Right.
issue a request
RFPs
for
and then-
proposal
yeah.
first, and then you have a bidders conference, and we have rebid the commissary or canteen, if you will.
Right.
That's it's sort of like a convenience store for inmates on the inside. And we are in the process of issuing an RFP for the private prison contracts.
Right.
The importance of that, Jerry, is
Go ahead.
really
Please do.
3 of the 4 that the commissioner just mentioned are by far the bulk of the contract dollars that are spent. Food services, as you would guess, medical services, as you would guess, and then what folks might not think of is the management cost of the privately owned prisons also is contracted through the Department of Corrections.
Right, exactly. And how much money are we talking about, Andy, when we're talking about like the private prisons? So we can go ahead and...
Well, Commissioner, you have to help me here some, but we're talking about scores of millions of dollars in each of those categories.
You know, we're looking at
Was it 70?
the medical alone is 100+ million.
100 million just for the
The
medical.
privates, I believe, are in the 70 million
That's why I
range.
thought it was like 70 some
Yes.
million. Yeah. So,
And on our overall budget for this fiscal year is $382 million. So a lot of that is taken up with contracts.
now a lot of the original idea behind private prisons was they were going to operate, am I right? The original idea was they were going to operate in Mississippi 10% cheaper than the state prisons.
That's correct.
And we had,
I'm going to say, what have y'all found? Because I know that was a question y'all
well,
had.
that they're not, the short answer, that they're not. But let me say, first of all, I'm not a proponent of private prisons. At this time in our state's history, I don't think they're the right answer for us. But let's think about where we were when they were rolled out.
Sure.
We were dealing with the 85% rule, as Madam Chairman already pointed out.
We were building needed prisons right and left.
So when somebody went to jail, he was going to be in jail for a long time. And then on top of that, the federal court stepped in and said, you have to assess a certain minimum space for every inmate and certain adequate living conditions for every inmate, which much of our existing publicly owned facilities at the time couldn't be in compliance. So the private prison said, well, we'll take care of that as well. Now, has it turned out to be a great deal for the state? In my judgment, the answer is no. Was it something that we probably had to do at the time? Probably.
Any thoughts on that, Eric, about the private prison system and how it's operated and here in Mississippi and what the future is, do you think?
I agree that, yes, probably at the time they offered a solution to a problem because one thing is people may not realize, unlike you and I that argue we can't afford it, the courts don't accept that from government.
Right.
You need to abide by these rules, and if you have to spend money, you'll spend money. And so there's only so much you can grow, Department of Corrections. And you have to realize nationwide, the prison population increased by 5-fold, yet the staffing is only increased by 2.4-fold.
Wow.
And so, but part of the problem is that before this major recession, there were many states, Oklahoma, Michigan, that could not, they had positions unfilled.
Right.
And so you need to turn to somewhere because people are just, you can't do things. And so, yes, most of the literature is awash on private prisons. The things that they promised did not materialize. And so, and some of the problems, if you read, is government control of private prisons. They're not directly like normal prisons where the governor would call the commissioner and say, we have a problem, solve it now, type of thing. So, because you have to remember, most private prisons are for profit, and so they will answer not just to the state that's contracting them, but to a board as well that's also concerned about their long-term well-being as well. So.
Right. Yeah. private estate. Anything else
Well,
on that, Senator?
One thing that has come to my mind as they're talking about this, there was a situation within my Senate district where the company that was managing a prison 2 weeks before Christmas a couple of years ago just said, we don't want to do business with you anymore, and so they shut it down. Well, that has left a county having to handle all the expenses of the building because their county jail is part of that facility, and it's been a real expense for the county. Never mind the fact that approximately 200 employees were put off right before Christmas, and they've had to be absorbed into other areas to get jobs. And of course they said, well, they can come and work in another one of our facilities. Well, nobody's going to pack their children up mid-year right before Christmas and move to another part of the state or to another part of the country. So that was sort of a heartbreaking thing, I thought. You know, Parchman may be a bad place to be, but we know it's going to be there. And there's a certain level of job security if people are doing a good job. And I don't think that the reason, it was just purely a business decision that this company left. And it's been a hardship for the county and for the people of the community. So.
Now, you're talking about the LaFleur County facility. Now, just to update people on that and understand what MTC, there may be some discussions about possibly a federal prison coming in there.
Well, I've been on bended knee to the commissioner talking to him about the importance of getting those jobs back in LaFleur County.
I'm talking about the feds, the federal prison.
Well, I'm hoping the commissioner will put in a good word for us with his friends in high places.
There you go.
But whatever we can do, there are people that are trained because that facility was there for a long time.
Right.
And there are people that if the jobs became available again, I'm sure they would apply. And LaFleur County being in the Delta, you know, that's a problem. Unemployment's a real problem, and I'm trying to find jobs for them wherever I can.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Marshall, most recently, y'all have been conducting a number of raids, or whatever you want to call them, at the various prisons. And in fact, the state police have been involved with this, am I right?
That's correct.
And we'll talk about that. Talk about, you know, kind of why you decided to do these and what the results of it have been.
Okay. Can I go back to the corrections officers just for a brief minute?
Sure, please
I
do.
want all of you in here, I know, have iPhones, cell phones. Some of you are on them right now, and that's good. I got one on my hip and one on my briefcase over there. But I want you to picture this about the corrections officers and the prisons. Somebody's got to be there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. When you go on shift there, you may be doing an 8 to 12-hour shift. You cannot take a cell phone in there if you are a corrections worker. So you have no contact at home, to anybody at home. If somebody else doesn't show up, and we have a 51% turnover rate of corrections officers, somebody doesn't show up for shift, you might have to do a double shift. And you may not even be able to get a hold of your significant other or your parents if you're 18 years old still living at home and tell them that you're not coming home that night. So that's kind of where they're living at. We do. You have to imagine that inside jails or prisons, you have the same subcultures as you have out here in the so-called free world. You got, you know, there's sort of like survival of the fittest and he who's strongest, and people sort of set their own subculture parameters within the prisons. There's activity in there just like there is on the street, but one of the things that happens is just like on the street, there's violence inside the prisons. There are what we call shanks, which are homemade weapons. We've been doing a number of what we call shakedowns. We've hit 5 different prisons over the past, well, I've been there, 3.5 months. We started hitting them around February the 1st. We found well over 200 shanks in 5 different prisons. We found over 100 cell phones. We found tobacco is a huge contraband item and actually is more expensive inside the prison system than marijuana or other drugs are. We found a tremendous amount of tobacco. We found marijuana. Any other drugs that you find on the street, you can find them within the institutions. I've been told by the people who are the real corrections experts who have been doing this for 25 and 30 years that we can shake a prison down today and come back in 2 weeks and we're still going to find cell phones and tobacco and shanks and other contraband. So it's an ongoing battle, and it looks like that we, over the past 6 or 8 weeks, 2 months, have been doing something maybe that hasn't been done before. That's not necessarily true. What we're doing different, if you will, is going in with a massive show of force with a bunch of probation and parole officers who are part of corrections, corrections officers who are the prison guards, Mississippi State Highway Patrol who come to assist us with security. And instead of doing it section by section within the jail, and if you can imagine 2,500 inmates being in a place, 3,000 inmates at Parchman, we're doing it simultaneous. We're hitting everybody simultaneous. So there's a pipeline within the institution, just like there is on this campus. If something happens, the rumors go. They're here. They're in cell block A. So they're coming. They're going to come all the way to cell block Z, and there's no cell block Z. I'm just, okay. But that's why we're doing it in such a massive show of force, because they're limited to their imagination as far as hiding places, and they can make weapons out of anything. Mm-hmm. I hope that covers it.
Well, and what does that tell you? I mean, what is it? You find cell phones and tobacco and these other things. What do we deduce from this? What we can conclude from the fact that there is such ready access to those things?
Well, and again, it's not the only way to get contraband in, but we have to believe, we have to know that we've got staff, corrections officers, who are introducing contraband into the institutions. And that does happen. It happens on a pretty regular basis. And when it does, and we catch them, they are charged criminally. We actually refer the cases to the appropriate prosecuting authority, the district attorney in that venue, and it's up to them to prosecute them.
Eric, in your experience in studies and research, talk about that, the aspect of contraband and corruption as well, behind bars.
Well, you will find, as the commissioner pointed, whatever you will find in free society, you will find in prison. Research indicates, depending on the correctional facility, between about 35 to 60% of the contraband will be brought in by staff, and some of it is correlated to pay, so raising the pay would be good, because you're going to be offered money by people to bring in drugs, because people don't realize this. The drug organizations can get higher prices there than they can in the community where there's greater competition. And so there's a lot of money to be made. There's a book, Hot House, about Leavenworth. Is the Aryan Brotherhood did the gambling there. They were making about $150,000 to $250,000 profit a month from running gambling rings.
That's a lot of money.
They're organized crime. In California, the Federal Bureau of Prisons and the FBI raided things. You had drug cartels and the Mexican mafia involved buying contractors that were bringing in goods to the prison, and so they were smuggling things.
Like not staff, but people that were...
They were bringing in machinery, and so inside the machinery would be cocaine and methamphetamines and other things. Your other biggest problem is your visiting room. Lots of contraband is going to take place there, particularly drugs, but it's hard to deal with that because all the research indicates familiar contact, particularly physical contact, is one of the top 5 predictors of how they'll release. If they get regular visits and everything else, they'll do much better when released back to the community. And so, but we also know that violence is a severe problem because 95% of the inmates are coming back, and usually you would think it would be, most people think it's one gang member against another. Usually, no, it's the highly predatory preying upon those who aren't violent. And the research indicates that when that happens, they're 5 times more likely to come out to society and commit a violent crime than they were if they had not been victimized. So, and it also sends the wrong messages, because prison should be the safest places in the world, because we send people there because they can't follow rules. And if you have people with making weapons, threatening others, you send the message, the strong take what they want. And that's not how society works. Our weakest members of society should be safe just like anyone else. And so I agree with the commissioner. It's a problem and you have to address it. And you have to keep working at it, and you have to hold people accountable for things. And some of it is training as well, because I used to train correctional officers. They don't like doing shakedowns. They really don't like doing the pat-downs where inmates know they're going to hide the contraband, particularly in the groin area and everything else. Is how do you properly search somebody so that you search every part of their body to make sure they're not doing this. And by the way, I've seen things in prisons where you saw that still of a gin still on MASH. I've seen inmates put that up, making gin that's better than you can get from Beefeater or that. I've seen an inmate one time, we had to disarm him, build a battle axe out of pallet wedges welded onto a metal pipe. It's a 6-inch battle axe. And so, I mean, clearly we failed there. I mean, that shouldn't have happened. But the dialogue's very important because most of the contraband that's coming in, you can also find, not just from shakedowns, but you should have information coming because most inmates will tell you, I mean, we have found when I worked for the Federal Bureau of Prison, guns were brought in. It was inmates that were telling us the guns were coming in because they said, this is just going to be bad for everybody. I just want to do my time and get out. And so...
And Andy, I know y'all had a public hearing not that long ago.
2, actually, yeah.
Yeah, 2, that's right, 2. And so talk about that, some of the things you heard from families and others, people who are connected.
Thanks. We held 2 public hearings in March, one in Cleveland, primarily designed to be near Parchman in the Delta area, and then one in Jackson because there's a major state facility in Rankin County as well. And interestingly enough, for every one comment we heard about the contract issues, which was our scope of work, we heard 10 comments about non-contractual issues. And I must tell you, I'm very sympathetic to the hearts of these people, it's primarily parents, but in some cases spouses or siblings, who just wanted to tell somebody about what they were having to endure. And I come back to the contraband point, as the commissioner well knows. I suspect that, like me, many of you in this room, when you first heard about, well, they're smuggling in cell phones, kind of chuckled and said, well, they must be wanting to talk to their girlfriend or talk to their mama. You know what they're doing? They're extorting people outside the walls. So they'll use a smuggled cell phone to call another inmate's mama and say, you either be sure I get some money next Friday or I'm about to pound Tommy. Mm-hmm. Now, sometimes Tommy's in on the scheme. Don't think Tommy's completely innocent. But the fact of the matter is that people in the so-called free world, to use the commissioner's characterization, are being victimized just as surely as people are on the inside being victimized. And so what we heard pouring out of people's hearts and souls was help our sons, our daughters, our nephews, our husbands inside.
And you heard too I know from Ms. Marino, whose son was unfortunately killed, and the idea or allegation, we don't know if it's true or not, that there may have been staff involved in some of these violent acts. I mean,
you know, one of the concerns, obviously, always in a public hearing is people are not under oath and they don't have all the facts at their disposal, and you're hearing one side of a story. And,
well, that's very true.
I'm certainly sensitive to that. But on the other hand, that woman's son died inside, which isn't supposed to happen.
Right.
It's just not supposed to happen. And Commissioner Fisher, who is one of the finest, most devoted law enforcement people I've ever known in my life, can't fix that. We all have to figure out how to fix that.
Good point. Senator, I know you've worked on, let's begin to talk about the front end of this. I know you've worked with some programs that are kind of aimed at preventing people from going to prison in the first place, which I think obviously has got to be something that happens
That's
as well.
correct. For 2 years, I ran a dropout prevention program in the Mississippi Delta, and we had 6 different schools in LaFleur County schools and in the Greenwood schools. And of course, the thing that you and I were talking before this meeting, and I said it broke my heart because a lot of these children, you talk to them one-on-one, well, what do you want to be when you get out of school? And of course, our goal was to get them to graduate from high school. And you'd never hear a child say, oh, I'm going to be a drug dealer or I'm going to be a convict. They'd all say, I'm going to be a veterinarian or a doctor or an attorney. You know, the problem was they didn't have enough support amongst their family to make a successful life. And it's something that's very important. Literacy, I think, is one of the biggest things we can do to help keep people out of jail. I understand California bills the number of jail cells that they need for the future based on the number of third graders who aren't able to read on grade level, which is kind of scary. Currently, I'm working with a program, and you're all invited to do this. The Rotary clubs in Mississippi have a literacy project whereby Rotarians go into the classroom. We have 2 classes at Marshall Elementary School in Carrollton, and we work with 4-year-old and 5-year-old students. Do diagnostic testing, and then they are in cooperation with Mississippi Public Broadcasting doing the Between the Lines program. And we'll go in at the beginning of the school year and test the children and then go back at the end of the school year. And it's phenomenal to see what they have learned, how much their reading scores have improved. So I think that's a big part of it. If we always used college students to serve as mentors with these kids in the high school, it was amazing that a college student would sometimes be able to have more of an impact on a 7th or 8th grader than any of us grown-ups. You know, college kids were cool and we weren't. So that's a big part of it, is to try to be proactive. And the other thing that was a big problem in the Delta is we'd see children having children, and there were never 2 parents around to help them. So that was a lot of the problem we were trying to combat.
What about you and Eric in terms of research? What are some of the things pointed at in terms of what are some of the things we can do to try to prevent things on the front end from being so?
Well, prevention problems are very important. Getting involved early on is very important. Abraham was in Michigan, was an 11-year-old convicted as a 12-year-old for murder. But the police knew his family at age 4, but then the police said, I can't get involved by the Michigan law until he's 10.
Yeah.
That's the problem, is that we know problems exist. We know what works, by the way. There's a lot of research, but the problem is the public demands 100% certainty, which you can't do.
Yeah.
I always like to point at the medical model. If you use that approach, then we just quit on cancer. I mean, we spend a tremendous amount of money, but we've moved from, like, say on one cancer from 50 to 70% survival rate. That's a success. If we could move from recidivism from 50% and get it down to 30%, which we know programs work, that's a failure, which I don't quite understand. It's moving in the right direction. But again, I work for people that, you know, in the federal government that used to say a good day is when 60 minutes doesn't drive up the front drive. In other words, we're not here to succeed, we're here not to fail, which is different. Because you have to take chances. So prevention programs are very important. They're far cheaper. Education is very important. You have a lot of people that can't get jobs. Our society is changing from the old manufacturing type of things to a very tech-oriented field. Then also is, you know, one thing is look at prisons. And all the research shows that of things, rehabilitation, deterrence, incapacitation, in that the most important thing that they do, and they do very well, is incapacitation. People that you have just said, we cannot trust you in our society because you pose such a risk. They're the worst place to send people for treatment, particularly drug addicts or that. That's like taking someone, a trauma victim of a major accident, to the CVS Minute Clinic and saying, deal with them. I mean, all the specialists, all the psychologists, all the treatment facilities tend to be in communities, not in prison. I mean, and so that when we ask prisons to do things they may not be designed for, we shouldn't be surprised when they don't necessarily accomplish that. And deterrence doesn't work because everyone believes that it's severity of punishment. All the research shows there are 3 things you have to have in place for deterrence to work. Knowledgeable people, rational people. If you meet a lot of people and you ask the commissioner in prison, they're not necessarily rational. I mean, they don't think things out long term. But the most important thing is certainty. I mean, I've ridden with state troopers and other things, and they're like, let me show you something. And the speed limit's 75, and they slow down to 60, and no one will pass them. But there are no police around. They don't care that the fine could be $300 in this state. I'll do it, because I know I probably won't get caught. And if you talk to most criminal offenders, they feel they're not going to get caught.
Right. Right. And we're talking about drugs, and of course I know that was kind of been, you spent many, many years as a narcotics officer and head of drug enforcement and Mississippi Bureau of Narcotics. 75% of the people behind bars in Mississippi are addicted to alcohol or drugs. And that's a lot of folks.
Well, unfortunately, a lot of crime is tied to abuse of narcotics. There are, of course, people in jail for distributing narcotics. But if you go back to property crimes, violent crime, a lot of that is tied to narcotics use. And unfortunately, people who are addicts commit crimes. But I agree with Eric here. To put somebody behind bars that's an addict and expect it to fix them is like painting your house when it's on fire. It's ridiculous. And I want to bring another point here too about people who are in the prisons. You got some hardcore, what I call mainline recidivists who are in there for some really bad things. You know, this world, I say a lot of times, you know, if you could read the thoughts of some of the people you'd walk by on the street, you'd probably dry heave. Unfortunately, there are people out there like that. Unfortunately, the only place that they're going to wind up is behind bars. But you've also got people that are in prison for long terms who were people just like you who got out and had a DUI on a weekend, like all of us have done in college or in the military, and they had an accident and somebody died, and they go to jail for vehicular homicide for 20, 30, 40. I know one individual who's in for 60 years who was a college student, just like you all. So you think he's a criminal? He's not a criminal. But he's in there serving time with people who are hard-line, real criminals. And my tasking before I took this job and in my other life was to put people behind bars. We made drug cases on people. Now with corrections, you've got the task of making sure the public is safe from people who are incarcerated. It's a public safety issue. You got a task with making sure your people are properly trained in order to keep them safe, but you're also tasked with making sure the inmates are safe from each other. And it's sort of a, as my friend Andy said, sort of a no-win situation.
Any thoughts on that, Andy? What you've seen? I know y'all have heard a lot of information with the task force about these kind of issues.
Well, I'm literally the least of these, my brethren and sistren, on understanding corrections policy. I have no expertise except what I have learned over the course of the last 4 or 5 months. But one thing that strikes me and that we've heard many times is that there really is some wisdom in this regional jail concept, which is rather than trying to house 3,000 inmates in the same location, parse them out into smaller facilities that are more manageable. The populations could be then segregated into more like inmates in a particular facility and other kinds of inmates in a different facility. Granted, that means having some really bad guys in some really bad places, but it strikes me that's better than having some really bad guys with some really not so bad guys. And the third thing is that the evidence seems to be that this can be done in a very cost-efficient way as well. Now, again, I repeat what I started with. I'm not a policy expert, but it just intuitively makes sense to me that the more we can do closer to the local level, the more effective it's going to be.
Right.
That's something I'd like to address. One thing I learned when I was on the parole board, because I would talk to the members of the inmates' families as well as the victims' families. And as you can imagine, I gave out a lot of Kleenex to the people that would come in, because if you were a victim's family member, you were crying, and if you were the mama or wife of an inmate, you were crying. Everybody has somebody that loves them. No matter what they've done, everybody has somebody that loves them, and it's usually their mother. So call your mother. But
That's true.
The thing that occurs to me is important. I get a lot of phone calls being a state senator, and one of them is people, can we help get Sonny closer to home? His grandmama's 85, and it just about kills her to have to drive 3 hours to go see him on visitation. So that is a very good point that Andy has brought out. The people who are in jail are in prison, but a lot of times the people who are family members are in a type of prison as well because they're suffering. So whenever I can help get Sonny Boy closer to home so Grandmama doesn't have to ride 3 hours to see him, I try to help them do that because the whole family suffers.
And talk about, you and I were talking before about reentry. Talk a little bit about reentry and the importance of that. I know the legislature this past session, just in case y'all don't know, when someone gets out of prison, At least, I assume it's still this way. They get, what, $25 in a bus ticket, am I right? Is it? But now the recent legislation, and they've been working on it, I know the Reentry Council's been working on this, but basically now they have an ID. So to think about that, you're $25, a bus ticket, you're a convicted felon. How do you get a job? You don't even have a driver's license, or you don't even have any other kind of form of ID, nor is there an easy way of getting one. Now the Reentry Council and some others have been working on that. But anyway.
Well, I do think the prison industries program is a good one, because a lot of, you can look at the figures.
Right.
If it's a revolving door, then obviously we're not correcting anybody. And I always used to say when I was on the parole board, it's the Department of Corrections, not the Department of Eternal Damnation. 95% of those folks are going back into society, so we should do something with them while we have them to make their lives better, and maybe they'll be able to live successfully in society. But the prison industries program has some good job training things. And I know that there are other programs available within the prison system that people can learn to refinish furniture or reupholster furniture. Or I know at Parchment at one time, Marshall, I don't know if they're still doing it, they had a pretty good food industry where they were raising livestock and doing stuff. Is that still going on, or is that something? So there are job opportunities available within the prison system. And I hope that for the folks that will be coming back into society, which is most of them, that they get some jobs, skills besides corner drug salesman, because that's what got them in prison in the first place, was selling stuff on the street corner, a lot of them.
Any last thought before we open up to questions?
Well, I was just going to say reintegration is very important. As a society, we do a great job of ostracizing people, shaming them, forcing them out, rather than say, your deeds are bad, you're a good person, but what you've done is not acceptable. Research indicates the states that are very successful have they start 6 months in advance. They step them down. You have to understand, prisonization takes place. You tell people what to eat, where to work, what to do, what to wear. They're not used to this, and then you give them a bus ticket and say, behave yourself. It's not going to work. The research indicates you step them down. One good way is more evening reporting centers, halfway houses, stuff, but reentry things, because people aren't going to know this. I have a colleague that did a study. 70% of the probation parole officers in this state don't even know that there's an expungement statute here. That's one of the most important things if you have a nonviolent offender, is tell them, how do you get this record removed so you can get a job? Because there are most things, including McDonald's or Burger King, that if you check, yes, I have it, they're not going to talk to you. And so we've got to educate people, because there are other states, they're just the opposite. They actually give them forms, if they run through all these diagnostic things that are pretty good, and then they say, you're not a high risk, here's how you expunge your record. And we're going to reintegrate you. And also, you said job training skills are very important. There are prison systems out there, not necessarily this state. I was visiting another state. They're training their inmates on a printing press, a Heidelberg printing press. Heidelberg printing presses, which is typeset, has not been used since the mid-'70s. But again, they say, we can't bring in electronics because that'll be a threat to our security. Then why are you training people that can't get a job? They exist, Heidelberg presses, only in prisons and museums. So some of this is giving them...
training them for museums, right?
Give them opportunities, because the worst thing you can do is give them false hope. Train them for something that doesn't exist, or chances that they're not going to get. And you have to explain to them, you have to be honest about your record and everything else, because people are going to say, where have you been for this gap of time? So, and how do you do things to explain stuff, and job interview stuff are very important.
We're going to open up for questions. I don't know what protocol you have for that, but anyway, if you have a question, just shout it out, I guess. Yes?
Something I did not hear you guys discuss that seems to me to be a bit of an elephant in the room is the general disproportionate representation of minorities, specifically.
Sure.
Prisons across the country, but especially in Mississippi.
There's no question.
I know a lot of that is sort of on the other side, from either judges imposing harsher sentences on minorities, police officers disproportionately targeting them. But what are you doing as government and prison officials to try and sort of reduce the minority population, specifically of Black and Hispanic men in Mississippi prisons?
I guess that falls on you, Marshall.
It's a good one. Well, first, I think we, on the law enforcement side of it, I think a lot of that comes down to education. It's been around for a long time, a concept called community policing. Even back as far as many years ago when I was in the military, we had racial relations classes. I think it's a continuing conversation. We tend to, in law enforcement, tends to, whether it's in a city setting or a county setting, major metropolitan areas, they seem to go and enforce the law more in communities which are lower socioeconomic level communities where there tends to be more crime. And it's just the nature of that beast, and that's what happens. And then we have, as you well know, in some communities, there is, I believe Andy or Ms. Chassaniol talked earlier about family influence. We've got some of the lower socioeconomic levels in this country that don't have a two-parent family, single-parent families, and they're being raised literally in the streets by their peers. I don't think there's any one A-plus solution to any of it, other than we need to have a national conscience, if you will, that things are not exactly as we think they should be, and work toward trying. It's never going to be perfect, but we need to work in that direction. I don't think that answers your question, but it's a tough one, and it's good for me to hear that people like you are thinking in those terms. Thank you.
Yes.
But elaborate on corrections as big business. It's a $300, $400 million business.
Yep.
Your community wants people to come back and operate a jail there. I mean, it's the
Economic engine, or perceived as that.
You have contracts with people where you guarantee them that they will have a certain number of people and be paid a certain amount of money. Right?
I think the private prisons still do that, don't they? Have a contract along those lines?
That's right. The question is sort of speak to corrections as big business and the policy that allows for a guaranteed inmate population in a particular facility. The part of that, again, is the history of how we started to have private prisons in Mississippi. And again, I am not a defender of the policy. I'm just telling you what I've learned. And that is that in order to get the sort of accelerated construction that the state needed in order to house all these prisoners who were under the 85% rule and who were now federally entitled to additional living space that previously had not been the rule, or at least had not been enforced as the rule, the state essentially had to recruit private industry to hurry up and build these facilities. And so the owners of those facilities said, well, okay, but if I'm going to do that, I'm not going to be at risk for it. You're going to be at risk for it. So I'm going to build a facility that'll hold 300 inmates, which means you got to guarantee that I'm going to have 300 inmates, or you got to pay me the daily revenue stream for the equivalent of 300 inmates. You can say whether that was a good idea or a bad idea at the time. It surely seems like a bad idea now. Some would argue that it was the only way we could get the bed space we needed to house the number of inmates that the law said we had to house with the space that we had to house. Now, today, the commissioner or the professor made a great point a minute ago. Not only do they have to answer to the state of Mississippi and the Department of Corrections, they have to answer to their shareholders, which means they have to be returning a profit, which means if they're publicly traded every quarter, they got to report to Wall Street what they're doing. And so that means they got to figure out how to press dollars to the bottom line. So long as we have contractual relationships with private prisons, which is going to be at least for the intermediate term future, I predict not for the long term future, but for at least some period of time we're going to have to, it's just going to be the job of Commissioner Fisher and his colleagues to be hard negotiators and to drive those rates down as low as they can.
I think we have time for one more question. I saw one right over there.
Is there any evidence that if we increase somehow, increase funding for corrections in Mississippi, would we lower the recidivism rate? If we paid the guards more, if we had more guards, if we had more, better reentry programs, et cetera, could we lower the recidivism rate? Would we get more for our money?
How would we lower it?
I think certainly we ought to pay the guards more. There's no question about that. However, if you paid the guards $200,000 a year, if you got somebody that's going to go wrong, they're going to go wrong anyway. I mean, we had the Scruggs scandal here, but the budget-wise.
I'm asking if neighboring states, if they do a better job per inmate of funding their prisons, do they have lower recidivism rates in Mississippi?
I don't know. I don't know the facts on the neighboring states. I will tell you from a budget standpoint, though, if more money was directed toward programs, such as the senator talked about, training the people to get back out on the streets. You can't just give them a bus ticket and $25 and put them back in the hood or in the barrio, wherever they came from, expect them to go out there like with a convicted felon. I'm convicted of armed robbery. Who's going to hire him? But if we can train that person to do body work or in the culinary arts or something that they can take back, plumbing, electrician, something they can take back to the free world, and then develop programs. And some of these things are being done, believe it or not, but have programs to re-enter those people back into society, have employers who are willing to place these people, if you will.
And some of the things that are being done, actually some Ole Miss professors and some others are involved in going in and teaching classes.
Sure.
You know, at Parchment and elsewhere. And I think part of the problem, you know, I'm just giving my opinion, I mean, part of the problem is the regarding of people behind bars as less than, you know, that, and therefore they don't deserve, you know, and we see this on the comments we've had on the prison stories, and you've probably heard these too, Andy. It's like, take them out and shoot them, and, you know, that kind of attitude. And I understand it to some extent. I mean, I understand the anger. But on the other hand, it's an issue to deal with. And instead, as these professors I know, I've talked with them, going in and teaching these classes, it's amazing how it begins to change the inmates, for example. And that's pretty low cost. Yeah. You have something? Go ahead.
I only have one question about third graders. You mentioned that in California. In the state of Mississippi, third graders who are not at reading level will be retained.
They're being tested right now. And I'm not on the education committee, thank heavens, because that's a difficult committee to serve on. But I do think that if more people would become involved through the Rotary Literacy Foundation or through other opportunities within your communities, civic clubs, be involved, help somebody. You young people in particular could help a child with their reading skills. The children who are lap read are the ones that grow up able to read. If you can read well, thank somebody in your family who cared enough about you to make sure that you learn to read. It's a serious problem. It's a very serious problem. But people who can't read, they're robbed of so many riches and frequently are robbed of their freedom down the road.
But children who usually are retained in the third grade come into school lacking.
Yeah, way behind.
Way behind. I'm trying not to walk away from a microphone. When we were working with communities and schools, the children that were selected for the Communities and Schools program all had to be at least 2 years behind their reading level before we could take them in for special help. And, you know, it's a lot easier to teach someone to read when they're young and willing. Young and willing. And I'll bet everybody in this room has a younger sibling or younger relative, someone, a grandchild, for folks like us, but there's someone that you could take an interest in, and it'd be the greatest gift you could give them right now.
That's an excellent point to end on. We've run out of time. I'd like to thank our panelists once again, and I think we want to hear them.